Joining us now to speak on these developments regarding Iran is Behnam Taleblu, who's a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy. Mr. Ben Taleblu, thank you for joining us. And first, regarding these mysterious death cases of Iranian figures, how is this viewed in Iran, especially at the top in Iran? Is this considered as some kind of a failure, considering the fact that basically Iran is exposed, as it seems, to some kind of a foreign intervention?
Well, lovely to be with you, Jonathan. Thanks for having me. A couple of different takes within Iran. If you remember, this is not the first non-nuclear Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps official killed in Iran that many allege was killed at the hands of the Israeli Mossad. And in the past, specifically in the past few weeks, when these kinds of things had happened, the next day, the ultra-hardline press did not carry news of the killing of this individual, or they did it in a way that downplayed the attack. If you remember, even a few months back, there was a former intelligence minister in Iran talking about how all members or all Iranian government officials are not safe due to the presence of foreign intelligence services on Iranian territory. So it does highlight major security flaws in a regime that spends so much money and so much time on security and repressing its own people and coming up with a whole host of excuses. It really makes its own architecture look more like Swiss cheese. And that may be one reason why the Israelis may be doubling down and moving further down this line, particularly as no one in the international community has really come up with some kind of a coherent response against Iran's non-nuclear drivers of bad behavior in the region, like terrorism, missile arms development, arms proliferation, and things like that. There's also the idea of a popular reaction. The regime may be hoping that this drives the population towards it, but that doesn't really seem to be the case at all.
You mentioned an Israeli action where the world has not really been acting. Another such field could perhaps be the nuclear field, and we see Iran constantly progressing, now perhaps trying to enrich uranium at another site, underground site, deep underground in Natanz. Basically, as it seems, Iran perhaps gave up on the hope of a nuclear deal and has decided to go forward as much as possible.
Well, if Iran really does introduce fissile material and enrich uranium there, it would really be a game changer. And if there is any administration, Republican or Democrat, pursuing a deal along the lines of a JCPOA or JCPOA type of deal with such a facility being built, constructed, or heaven forbid, being operated, they should really disabuse themselves of a notion that there really is such a thing as a peaceful Iranian nuclear program, or that the regime doesn't harbor weapons design for the future. If you remember, there was the Fordo fuel enrichment plant, which was unveiled by the U.S. and members of the E3 back in September 2009, and that was buried several thousands of meters under a mountain near the holy city of Qom. This seems to be drawing from that same playbook, trying to use natural hardening to hide and obscure and make an attack on Iran's nuclear facilities more difficult. And the one reason is, what is Iran's ultimate goal for these kinds of infrastructure for its nuclear program? In my view, it's a weapon. And I think the fact that the regime resurrected its nuclear program during a war, has always had a military orientation for its program, and has increasingly layered on a civilian fiction for it, is the reason why they're trying to hide it and obscure it. So these are really dangerous but pivotal moments in Iran's nuclear future.
Judging by the fact that Iran is going to this path, have perhaps given up on the idea of a nuclear deal and decided to go forward?
Well, the regime loves to have its cake and eat it too. If it ever does ink some kind of a nuclear deal based on the JCPOA, it's not to become a responsible nuclear stakeholder. It's not to meet outstanding obligations related to monitoring and verification. It would simply be to delay an attack, buy time, and to get sanctions relief. So that incentive will always be there. It just depends on how fast and how much the regime wants to expand its nuclear architecture over time. And judging by what is reported about the scale and scope and presence of such a construction effort, it means that the regime believes much less in the diplomatic option than may be perceived.
If we look, say, 4 or 5 months back, it seemed back then as if a deal was closer than it seems now. It seems especially as if the U.S. administration was eager for that deal, as opposed to perhaps the case now. How are the Iranians perceiving this? How do they see that possible change in the American stance?
You know, you're absolutely right about the 4 or 5 months back part. You know, I remember nearly every weekend in Washington in January or February, everybody thought that the deal was going to arrive the next Monday, the next day, the next week, the next weekend. And that clearly hasn't been the case. Iran's supreme leader, and that's a title meant to be taken very literally, Ali Khamenei, feels ascendant. He believes he's survived the peak of Western pressure, which came from 2018 to 2020 under the Trump administration. And ultimately, he sees this Western, particularly American, desire for a deal as being something that he can exploit, which is why they probably raised the IRGC FTO sanctions revocation idea. It seems like the Biden administration has fortunately remained firm on that front. But it allows the Iranians more time and more space to come up with more excuses. And ultimately, as long as they keep the idea or the veneer of talks going, it can make it harder for an attack to happen. It can make really tough sanctions much more politically cumbersome to get together. So the regime has a strategic logic of expanding its program and feigning an interest in talks. The question is, at what technical threshold or political threshold would the Biden administration be willing to push away from the table on this? And here we have to remember what the Europeans said in November 2021. And these are the Europeans who have been so eager for a deal. They talked about Iran's nuclear gains back then, November 2021, as eroding the counterproliferation value of the JCPOA. And look how much has just changed and been added to since then.
Very interesting insights there. Behnam Ben Taleblu, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.